So HTMX, as the name suggests, it like extends HTML. It adds new attributes you can add on HTML elements. So, but at the end, HTMX is just a JavaScript library that helps you avoid writing JavaScript in the client side basically. So HTMX is based on the concept of hypermedia driven applications. So what does this mean? Basically, your APIs return some JSON file and you consume it on your front end. And based on that, you create a UI. But in hypermedia driven applications, what happens is your API, instead of returning some JSON file, they return HTML directly. So, but most of the sites already do it, but on a whole page level. If you go to any sites, maybe made through Next.js or something like that, you will see in the response tab, you will see the whole HTML rendered as a response, also known as SSR. So that's it. But what is in the motivation behind HTMX? In normal HTML, we only have anchor tags and form tags to make HTTP request. Mostly get using anchor tags and post using the form tag, right? And only click and submit events trigger them, right? But and when we trigger them, our entire page reloads and any data we had gets lost. But HTMX remove these constraints, and in HTMX you have elements the same as HTML5, and any element can trigger any request, mainly which are these. At its core, it deals in making Ajax request, and if you're a front end or a back end developer, you might be aware of these requests: get, post, put, patch, delete. So in HTMX, what happens is any element can trigger any of these requests, and whatever the API returns, the API should also return HTML, and whatever it returns, it will be automatically updated with that content. So right, so this is a small demo. So let's say we had a button, and we have an attribute called hxgat, and it hits /ping, right? And in response, let's say our API /ping endpoint returned a text called pong. So in the result, what will happen is the inner HTML of the button by default will be replaced by the by whatever the API sent us the response. So we have some triggers, HTML triggers. So triggers allows you to specify what triggers an Ajax request. So by default, uh, for input select in text area, the default trigger can be changed. In the form element, it's submit, and every other element, it's the click event. So whenever you hit a trigger, a request is made. So here's a short example. So I have a div over here, and I'm making a get request to my endpoint, which is /hover, and the trigger is mouse over. So what will happen here is whenever I will put my mouse cursor over the div, the request will be made, and whatever HTML is sent by the API will be replaced to the inner HTML. And same goes with the text area over here. The endpoint I'm hitting is /format, and the trigger is paste. So whenever I paste something in the text area, I will make a get request to the endpoint. And you can also see more examples like this over here. And but by default, what happens is whenever you make a request and you get some HTML back from the API, the element that made the request, its inner HTML is completely changed with the response. But sometimes we don't want that, right? Let's say we had a button and we kind of made a post request and we get some HTML document back. So that button's inner HTML will be changed. So this is not we want every time. So we can make use of targets. So here's an example. So this button makes a post request to /register, and hx target is the ID response div. Currently the response div is empty above, and whenever now the response will come, it will be inserted to the inner HTML of the div. So the button is saved, and the swap thing over here I will explain. So by default in HTML we have swaps. So we have some swaps like inner HTML, outer HTML, after begin, before begin, that kind of stuff. And here is a small visual representation of that. So outer HTML is basically outside the element, inner HTML is inside the element, and before begin is the kind of the same, before the element, and after begin is after the element, before end is before the element ends, and after end is after the element, right? So we also have some nice stuff like loading indicators in HTMX. So whenever a parent makes a request, so when the request is in flight, you can have a spinner or something like that to show a indicator. So preferred languages and templating options we have. For JavaScript and TypeScript, we have Express, Koa, and for templating, we will use JSX, ES, or handlebars, and same goes for the other stuff. And I have a short demo to show. Here is a small to-do list I made. So I've used Go and a database SQLite for it, and for templating, I'm using my package called Temple. So basically, I have my. So let's see what happens in the demo first. As soon as I start my page, the whole HTML content is rendered over here, right? And whenever, let's say, I add a to do, it could be eat your food. So what happens here? I make a request to slash to do's endpoint, and from the server, I get back this HTML content, right? And whenever I get this HTML content, I just put it over here. Let me show you this in the code as well. So I'm hitting this handle create to do endpoint, and I'm sending a new to do item. So what this to do item is, yep. So let's go to the form. Yeah. So here we had the form, and inside the form we wrote something, and this button, we had this button, and over here, whenever the form is submitted, I make a post request to this endpoint slash API slash v1 slash to do's, and the hx target is to do list, which is element inside my other component, and hx swap is before end, basically before ending of the element itself. And let's see what happens here. Whenever I submit this, I hit this endpoint, hit this post endpoint slash to do's, and whatever is a return from the server here, which is basically a to do item, that is appended to my DOM. So it was easy. Now let's see some of features, like you can also delete this or toggle this. So let's see how I toggled this. So I made a put request to slash to do slash toggle slash ID, and what this does is it takes the current ID of the to do and sends it sends this to the store here and makes the appropriate changes, and after that we get this. So basically we have a check called to do dot completed. If it's checked, we add the attribute called checked in our item, in our input, sorry, and if it's unchecked, we set a attribute of unchecked. So let's see how we can make a delete request. So whenever I click over this button, as you can see, I get nothing, because by default HTMX requires a status of 200 and a content of nothing to get replaced by the content itself. And if I go to the to do item over here, so this button makes a delete request to slash API slash v1 slash to do's with a to do ID, and the target is this slash to do slash ID, which is the whole list item over here. So what happens is, and I'm also using hxswap, which is out of HTML. So whenever I get a 200 request back, as you can see, I get a 200 request back, so the whole element is deleted. So in this, I've used all major Ajax requests: get, post, delete, and put. So this was it. Thank you.